Amen. How great thou art. He is truly, truly great. If you have your Bibles, turn to Genesis chapter 30. Genesis chapter 30. We're continuing our study in the beginnings of Israel, and that's through the life of Jacob. And we've been focusing on the wives of Jacob, Leah and Rachel, and the birth of their sons, whereby we can understand their spiritual journey. We saw, first of all, that Leah had 4 sons that were born unto her. And through the naming of those sons, she reveals that God sees her, that the Lord would hear her, that through the fact of this relationship that her husband would be attached to her. And finally and ultimately, she said that she would praise the Lord. And then it says that she has children no more. There's a pause or a period in that. And we looked at Rachel's life, and Rachel, first of all, couldn't have children, so she got angry with God, angry with her husband, and she decided, instead of petitioning for God and asking God to answer, that she would come up with her own plan. So she gives her maidservant Bilhah, and they have 2 children. He has 2 children by Bilhah. And then eventually she is going to have children. She'll be the last to have it. She'll have 2 of those children, Joseph and finally Benjamin. And through that experience, we find that Rachel does not grow in the Lord, does not have a spirit of satisfaction in her heart. And even whenever Benjamin was named, she was named him the child or son of my sorrows. Now we want to back up, and we want to, in a sense of backing up dealing with Leah, we want to look at the continuation of Leah's journey and Leah's life in the birth of some other children after what we had read to begin with. Now, as you see Leah, you find out that we know that she was the unloved, the unchosen of the wives. She was the one that was snuck in there and given to Jacob instead of Jacob choosing her. And therefore, she is not loved like Rachel was loved. But obviously, Leah had a good heart because God chose her. God chose her to be the tribal mother of most and many of the boys who would make up the nation of Israel. She is actually going to be the mother of 6 of those sons, and along with her maidservant, if you count those 2, she has a relationship with 8 of the 12. And that's because Leah had a heart, obviously, that loved the Lord and loved God. And God chose her, and God said, I'm going to use you, and I'm going to bless you. And so you see the fact that she has the birth of those first 4 sons, and in those she gives glory to God and testifies about God and who the Lord is. But then there comes a pause in her experience. You find that there in verse 35 of chapter 29. Very last statement. Then she stopped bearing. There was a pause in her bearing of children. That was a God-ordained pause. What do I mean by that? Well, she's eventually going to have some more children. But there was a time when God stopped and she no longer had children, and there was this, the bearing of children was no more. And that pause is for a reason. Would you please write this down? In your spiritual journey, when God brings you to a pause, there's always a reason for it. When you have a pause in your spiritual journey, there's always a reason for it. Find out that reason. Allow the Lord God to teach you in the midst of that pause. Trust in Him, pray to Him, and allow Him to bring to pass what He desires. Most people messed it up, and we're going to find out Leah does too. See, most people in the midst of the pause, they, instead of waiting on God and trusting in God, they began to fall into the trap of others and devise their own plan. Now, why do you think that God would pause Leah from having children? There's a good explanation for that. He wanted Leah, as well as everybody else, to understand that the fact that she had 4 sons right in a row was not attributed to the fact of the fruitfulness of her womb, but it was attributed to the grace and favor of her God. See, every gift from the womb is a great reward and a gift from God. And God wanted Leah to understand it's not just because you're fruitful, it's not just because you're able to have children that you have these boys. I've given these boys to you because you have found favor with me. It was a time for her and for everyone to acknowledge that God has given those boys. God has blessed them. And that is what she needed to understand and what God wanted to help her to understand and for everybody to understand. But that pause is difficult in her life and in our lives. Well, what happens next? Well, we know what happens. There, beginning in verse 30, Rachel, who's not able to have children, complains to her husband, and he says, I can't help you. It's God who did this. And she says, well, I want you to go into my maidservant Bilhah, and I want you to have children by her. And he does. He goes in, and she has 2 children. 2 children by her maidservant. Now, I want you to get in your mind, you need to get this in your mind because it's very important. That is a family full of preschoolers. Now, these children aren't 15 years old when the next was born. These are all born right after one another. I mean, Leah's were probably born year after year. The reason I say that is in a few minutes, whenever her son Reuben goes out and picks up the mandrakes, he's not about 4 or 5 when he does that. He's not a teenager. He's just a preschooler out there picking up stuff. So could you imagine what that household would be like? One preschooler can throw you into a turmoil, amen? But imagine all those preschoolers and changing all those diapers. I'm telling you, they were everywhere. All of those born into that family. And Rachel says, I want to have some, and she has them by Bilhah. And what is Leah going to do? What happens next? Notice what takes place in verse 9 of chapter 30. When Leah saw that she had stopped bearing, and she also saw that Rachel had given her maidservant to Jacob, she took her maid Zilpah and gave her to Jacob as a wife. Why in the world did she do that? Why would she even do that? That's such a sad commentary in this story. I mean, here's the woman who has been working and trying to deserve the attention and love of her husband. She's been battling against her younger sister Rachel. Rachel ends up giving Bilhah to Jacob as well to be another wife. Now she's competing against her. Why in the world would she ever give her maidservant to be another woman that she has to compete with? Why'd she do it? Because of what was happening in her heart. What was happening in her heart? Well, one of those things we know she was jealous about the fact that she wasn't able to have children anymore. And here's Rachel the favored one. Bilhah is now going and having children, and they're naming those children. And she becomes jealous. Never do you see that she necessarily had that jealousy, but that jealousy creeps within her heart. I mean, it just creeps within her heart and creeps within her life. The other aspect of it is the fact that in the midst of that waiting, she became impatient. She became impatient. She needed to see something happen. She needed to have something to take place. And she wasn't bearing any children, so she needed to follow the example of her sister. Make this note, it's not profitable to follow bad examples. Okay? Just write that down. When it's a bad example, don't follow it. Whenever somebody's made the mistake, it's not going to do you any good to make the same mistake. Whenever Rachel did what she did with Bilhah, it wasn't God's plan. That wasn't what God ordained. She just came up with her own plan. And so instead of waiting on God, she got her own plan. Well, what does Leah do now? Under this pressure of being jealous about that situation, finding herself unable to have children, afraid that she's going to lose the favor that she has with her husband at this point, and impatient, unable to wait, she does something that is unthinkable. She gives her maidservant another woman that she'll be competing with for the attention of her husband. What a sad commentary. Matter of fact, it's such a sad commentary that she takes a step back from her spiritual journey. Whenever we talked about Leah a few weeks ago, I shared with you that she was really a remarkable woman in her spiritual journey. Remember her naming her children? God sees. The Lord hears. I will praise the Lord. What powerful statements. Now, something that you really don't realize that you need to focus on is there's some subtle things in there that are different between her and Rachel that you have to notice. There's a difference between her and Rachel. For instance, look there in verse 33 of chapter 29. Whenever she names her son, she says, 33, this is just one of them, because the Lord has heard. You need to circle that word, the Lord. That word, the Lord, there is the word Jehovah. Jehovah, the covenant God. Jehovah, the covenant promise-keeping God. But when it comes to Rachel, look down in chapter 30, verse 6, in regard to it, this is what she says. And Rachel said, God has vindicated me. Circle the word God. Not the same word. That is the word Elohim. Elohim, which means the sovereign ruler, the God of a divine plan. One is the covenant promise-keeping God. The other one is the sovereign ruler. Leah, in her initial journey, she knows God is the covenant God, that promise-keeping God. But Rachel, in her journey, she only sees God as Elohim. He's the sovereign one. He's the one up in the sky who's in charge of things. It was far more intimate to know God as Jehovah than to call him simply Elohim. Well, what happens to Leah whenever she makes this mistake? What happens when she follows the wrong example of her sister? What happens when she lets her flesh take over instead of trusting in God, but rather she's impatient and jealous and has those things in her heart? Notice what happens when the baby's born in verse number 10. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, how fortunate. So she named him Gad. The Gad meaning fortunate, our fortune, are to be blessed. How fortunate. Look what happens in verse 12. And Leah's maid Zilpah bore Jacob a second son. Then Leah said, happy am I, for women will call me happy. So she named him Asher. Happy am I. Now, if you look at that just on the surface, that seems like that's okay. It seems like she says, well, how fortunate I am, or how blessed I am, and happy am I, and the women will all call me happy. But there's something that you need to note about that. Do you notice that she does not put the name of God anywhere in the names of these two children? Their names, it's not the Lord has done, the Lord has said, the Lord has heard. The Lord's name is not. Elohim, even God, is not used in their names. You know what that tells you? It tells you that Leah was so sensitive in her spiritual journey that Leah realized that it wasn't really the work of God or the act of God that brought forth these boys, as much as it was the means of her own planned out strategy. See, she never sees that God was necessarily in that. Now we know God's the giver of every child. But in her mind and her plan, she never had the satisfaction that this was God's way. This is what God wanted to do. This is what God brought about, like she did with her first 4 boys. But rather, it was what she had done and what she had brought about and what her plan had accomplished. A second thing about that is noticeable regarding it is there in verse number 13. When she names Asher and she names him, happy am I. You see that? Happy am I. But notice something in the next phrase. For women will call me happy. Who's going to call her happy? Women are going to call her happy. But it doesn't say anything about, and God will call her happy. It's the women, not God. And what this passage is doing, it's revealing to you and to me, it's helping us to understand the spiritual journey that Leah goes through. And I want to tell you, of all this that you see in these about these women and naming their boys, this may relate to us more than anything else. This may relate to us more than anything. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever started out here and you have a close walk with God, and I'm telling you, you call him Jehovah, and you see everything that God's doing in your life, and you're excited about your journey with the Lord? Has something ever happened in your life that caused a pause? Has something ever happened in your life where you made the wrong decision? Has something ever happened in your life that you followed the wrong example? Has something ever taken place where you worked your own scheme instead of trusting God for those things? And all of a sudden something happens in your heart and you're not where you used to be spiritually? Oh, God is still God to you, but you don't sense His presence. You don't have the signature of His plan on your life. And you find yourself back away from God in a different place than you were because of the decisions you made and the sin that you committed in your own life. That's exactly where Leah was. Leah, in her journey and her walk, she had followed her own flesh, let jealousy, impatience, a desire to achieve over everything else God had done, caused her to move away from that intimacy with God where she knew that He was God Jehovah, the one who was the promise-keeping God, the God who was going to bring forth the tribes of Israel out of Jacob and them, the covenant-keeping God. Well, beginning in verse 14, you have kind of an interlude. You just heard about the birth of these children. But something interesting happens here, verse 14. Look what it says. Now in the days of wheat harvest, Reuben, and I told you Reuben probably at that time was about 4 or 5 years old, just like a child. Have you ever taken your preschoolers out or young children out, and they're out there in the field and they're going to pick up stuff and bring it to you? They found stuff, they're going to bring it. This is kind of what it's like. Reuben, who was the oldest, went and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Then Rachel said to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." Now, mandrakes are about 2.5 inches in diameter. They're about the size of a small apple. They probably have a texture more like a tomato than an apple. And they were sweet smelling and supposedly delicious to eat. And people in that era ate them all the time. In that area, ate them all the time, still do. But it wasn't just the mandrake and they were good to eat, but they were also considered an aphrodisiac. But not only an aphrodisiac, they were considered also to make one fertile or to make one pregnant or to have children. And so when Reuben went out here and he picked up and he brought those in, there was this thought that, man, if whoever eats that's going to be able to have the children. Whoever has that's going to become fertile. So what does Rachel, who's not had any children, what does she do? What does she say to Leah? Hey, I want those mandrakes. Give me the mandrakes. I want to have them. Listen to Leah's heart, verse 15. See where she's come to. But she said to her, "Is it a small matter for you to take my husband? And would you take my son's mandrakes also?" So Rachel said, "Therefore he may lie with you tonight in return for your son's mandrakes." Did y'all catch the sense of that conversation? Leah's heart is such that she's full of pride. She's got jealousy. She's not going to benefit Rachel. You've taken my husband. You've taken his attention. You've taken his companionship. Remember, she was the first to be married to him. "And would you also take my son's mandrakes?" No, you took my husband. Now you're going to take the mandrakes? And she's saying that all because of this that's in her heart towards her. And Rachel says, listen to this, guys. "He may lie with you tonight." Obviously, we know who was in charge of that home, right? Rachel was obviously the one ruling things about what was going to happen. Not only with the women, but also with him. "He may lie with you tonight." And so through that bribe, through that hiring out, Leah has an opportunity to be with her husband. Think about the sadness of that. Look at verse 16. "When Jacob came in from the field in the evening, then Leah went out to meet him and said, you must, hear that? Must come in to me, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrakes." So he lay with her that night. Look what happens next. Don't fail to underline verse 17. "And God gave heed to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a 5th son." Now here's the irony of that. The irony is that the one who got the mandrake doesn't get pregnant till years later. But the one who doesn't have the mandrake gets pregnant. What's God doing? Just like God does with us. God says, it's not going to be mandrakes or any scheme or medicine or anything else that's going to do it. I'm the one that's going to do it. I'm the one that's going to bring forth the baby. I'm the one that's going to bring forth from the womb. It's not going to be your plan. It's not going to be your magic. It's not going to be your thing. It's going to be me. And Leah is the one who gets pregnant. Now, you find out a little bit about her spiritual journey. She's still praying to God. It says, and the Lord gave heed to Leah. What does that mean? That he responded to her prayer. She still has a spiritual journey with God. Even though she's taken a step backwards from where she was, she's let things creep into her heart that shouldn't be there. It's caused her to back away from the intimacy with God. She's still praying and she's still asking. And God gave heed to her prayers. Look what happens next. After she bore him a fifth son, here's what it says. Then Leah said, God has given me my wages because I gave my maid to my husband. So she named him Issachar. Issachar. Wages are the fact that I have hired out for my husband. It means wages. Now, here's kind of a sad thing in the naming of this child. The name of this child, she's almost trying to give an explanation so that she would be okay about some of the things she's done in her acts of sin. She says this, one thing that was wrong that she did is she gave her maidservant. But she says, God has given me this son because I gave my maidservant. I'm so selfless. I don't care about myself and my heart. I want it to be for my husband and I'm doing. That wasn't why she did that. But she's trying to explain away what she did. And another thing that she did that was wrong was when she went to Rachel and she hires out her husband. She forces her to say, yes, he can be with you because I'll give the mandrakes. I'll do that. And so what does she do? She puts those two experiences together. One where it was certainly not a spiritual sense of hiring out her husband, and the other was certainly not a wise thing in giving her maidservant in order to do that. So she puts it together and she says, Issachar reminds me that, listen, must be because of those things I've done. It must be okay that I did those things, for now I have a son. But it's not okay. Before you criticize her, before I would criticize her, could I ask you a question? Have you ever tried to explain why you did something wrong? Have you ever tried to justify yourself when you know you did the wrong thing? Have you tried to shine a good light on it? That's really a good thing. There's really something good that comes out of that. Even though we know we've sinned, we made the wrong decision. That's where she is. That's exactly where she is. Not only that, in regard to what she says in that, here's a very important thing. Look at verse 18. God has given me my wages because I gave my maid to my husband. Circle that word God, and that is the word Elohim. What's she calling God now? Jehovah? Covenant God, the intimate God, the promise-keeping God? No, she's calling him the name that Rachel called him. He's Elohim. He's the sovereign God. He's the divine plan God. But she's lost some intimacy with God in her life. Why? Because of sin, because of flesh, because of trying to explain what she's done. But she has a sixth son. Look there in verse 19. Leah conceived again and bore a sixth son to Jacob. Then Leah said, God has endowed me with a good gift. Now my husband will dwell with me or honor me because I have borne him 6 sons. Once again, the word she uses is the word not the Lord. She uses the word God or Elohim. the divine God. And what? He has endowed me with a good gift. Now, I want you to notice something. I pointed out about Rachel last week. I want you to notice, listen to what happens here in this verse 20. How many times does she use the personal pronoun? Listen to what it says. God has endowed me with a good gift, for my husband will dwell with me because I have borne him 6 sons. You think she might be talking about herself a little bit? You think she might be focused on herself a little bit? Just like who? Just like Rachel. And see, when sin creeps into your heart, sin creeps into your life, when sin moves in and takes residence there, you become full of pride. And pride always focuses on I or me. And that's where she's come to. God Elohim, not Jehovah. He has endowed me with a good gift. He's done this for me. Now my husband will honor me. Now my husband will dwell with me. It's all about me. I don't know what happens with Leah's life. I can tell you this in regard to it. Many of us find ourselves where Leah is. From where she began to where she is now. It doesn't record exactly what happens in Leah's life as far as her spiritual journey. I like to think she finally gets alone with God and gets right with God. Amen? That'd be great. But let me tell you what we need to do when we find ourselves in that position. We need to get alone and get right with God. And we need to have ourselves restored to where we're not talking about Elohim God, but we're talking about Jehovah God. And we're not talking about our plans, but we're talking about God's promises. And we need to realize that whenever we're in that place, we do have the opportunity to return. We're so fortunate because where we live versus where Leah lived, this is the beginning of Revelation. This is the progression of Revelation. This is only 30 verses out of the recording of human history. She doesn't know a whole lot about redemption. She doesn't understand about the cross that's coming. She doesn't know about Jesus and His blood and how He makes us clean. But we do. We live on this side of the cross. And we live with many, many chapters of the Bible that reveal to us truths like this, that if we confess our sins, whenever we've done the wrong thing, when we've acted the wrong way, when we've let flesh creep in and jealousy creep in and impatience rule our lives, that if we will confess our sin, that He is faithful and just to forgive us our sin and to cleanse us of all unrighteousness. You know what that tells us? That if we find ourselves in a spiritual condition where Leah is right here, that we can be restored to the position that Leah was to begin with. That we don't have to stay in that place where God is God, but He's not my intimate God. We can have that intimacy with God restored. What a glorious thing that is. Surely Leah would experience that same mercy of God, for God is the same yesterday and today and forever. But we know it in written form that God would forgive, and we understand that. Truths we need to learn from Leah and her second experience and a continuing journey. You might want to write these things down. One is, when a pause comes in your life, it's best to wait on God, for there's a reason. We're all going to have them. That pause may take different forms, but when there's a pause in your life, wait on God. There's always a reason. The second part of that is do not get ahead of God. Because whenever you get ahead of God, you're going to find that you're devising your own plan instead of following the Lord and His plan. If you're not willing to wait, there's only one thing it's going to do. If God's over here and He's having you wait, and you get out there ahead, you're going to be running your own plan and doing what you choose to do rather than what God would have you do. And that's going to be because you're going to be impatient. That's going to be because you might be jealous. It's going to be because somebody's going to give you an example to follow that's not the right example. It's going to be you're trying to find answers instead of wait for God's answers. But I'm here to tell you, when God says wait, it's best wait. Because if you run forward, you're going to get in trouble. You're going to be in that place. Third thing is, do not let the flesh, such things as jealousy, impatience, desire to get ahead, desire to find favor. Do not let those things rule your life. Do not let those things control your life, because it would totally, radically change you from what God made you to be. Don't let that happen in your life. It's so easy. So easy for that to creep in. So easy to dictate what you're supposed to be doing. But please, do not let that happen. A fourth thing, all that matters is what God thinks. God's not really impressed with what people think, even if the women are going to be happy. Even if the women are happy for you, even if the men are happy for you, if everybody's happy for you, what really matters is whether God's happy for you. And God's happy for you whenever you're obedient. So don't try to pacify and be accepted based on what people might think and might say in regard to those things. A fifth thing that I would say to you in regard to that is this: never, never allow yourself to make excuses for your sin. God, as long as you're trying to make excuses for your sin, trying to explain away why you do what you do, God will back up from you and He'll let you just talk all day long. God didn't say that He would forgive your sin because you explained it. He said He would forgive your sin because you confessed it. Okay? Now, I'm pretty good at that, because I can explain away a lot of things I try to do. But I can tell you it doesn't work. Okay? It just doesn't work. But confession does work. So just take it from me. Don't try to explain to God why it's sin. Just confess it and be cleansed of it. Confess and be cleansed of it. And the final thing is, please do not let your heart get so distant from God that you fall back in that old sinful pride, rather than being the one who says, my life is to praise the Lord. Remember what she said when Judah was born? This one, for this reason, I will praise the Lord. Nothing else. I will praise the Lord. Rather than coming down of saying, well, maybe, hopefully, through this good gift, I will be honored for what I have done. I'll be honored in all my pride by my husband. Don't let that happen to you. It's a lot more fun naming Judah than Zebulun. It's a lot more fun having the experience of Judah than Zebulun or Issachar. Why? Because your heart is good. Leah's heart was good. That's why she was chosen to be that tribal mother. Let your heart be good. Let it be clean. Let it be right. And let God use each of us